have Njabulo Mashigo sitting all the way in Amsterdam. She is the Director of Human Resources for Heineken Middle East and Eastern Europe. She has worked in a number of blue chip organizations such as South African Breweries, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, giving her extensive experience in human resources management. She was also a CHRO of the Year nominee in 2019 and currently the Talent Management Lead across 18 OpCos in Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe, overseeing, wait for it, 17,000 employees. Njabulo, sure, you have a massive role and you are at the front line of all this change. So given where we are now what? Over to you.
Thank you, Roy. I think as you've just highlighted, the employment landscape is transforming at quite a high speed, really driven a lot by technology, socioeconomic disruptions. And I really like this quote, which talks about the world is changing very fast and big will not beat small anymore. It's really about how fast we'll beat the slow. And I think regardless of the size of organizations that we have, everybody has to respond in a way that is speedy and shows agility. And I specifically wanted to highlight a few things from a talent management perspective. I focused on emerging markets, firstly because that's really where we operate, but I think a lot of these themes, firstly, are not new, but require maybe a new lens to look at them, given the challenges that we are experiencing at the moment, and also new solutions in terms of how we respond to them. Typically in the emerging market space, you find a lot of gaps around capability. There's been a huge shift in terms of the demand of skills, and I think a lot of traditional roles being phased out and the need to really respond to the future that we see versus where we are at the moment. Definitely brain drain, a big issue from an emerging markets perspective. How do we respond to talent, which is really voting with their feet? So we still have debates about the war for talent. Already a few years back, we've established that talent has won, but have organizations responded in a way that actually changes the value proposition for the talents that can choose to be anywhere? The build and buy mix in terms of the way that we approach capability. Firstly, it's expensive to buy. It's not always even possible, depending on the markets that we find ourselves in. And how do we start to open up ourselves in terms of being able to think differently about how we build the capability and repurpose and reskill the organizations that we have? And I think also on the point of talent blockers, there's the traditional understanding of talent blockers, maybe as people who stay long in a position, a key position that's needed for the future. But I'd also like to highlight it from a diversity and inclusion perspective, because again, it's a topic which should be exhausting by now because we always talk about it, but do we do enough to actually be able to be intentional in creating the right mix of talent from a diversity and inclusion perspective across the spectrum, not just the gender, race, age profile. When you look at generations, the type of skills that we want to be able to build the future that we say we want, and how do we accelerate that agenda? The solutions, just like the questions, require a new lens, and some of the areas, so one that I've touched on already, actively targeting that missing pool, however you define it in your various spaces from a diversity and inclusion perspective, challenging ourselves in terms of the mindset around ready-made talent versus creating our own human capital. Firstly, besides the obvious issues of not always having ready-made talent being expensive to buy, there's also just the reality of a lot of the jobs that we're looking at when you look at the future require that we look at actually almost reshuffling and repurposing tasks rather than the traditional understanding of jobs as we understood them. So how do we start to put energy towards that to make sure that we're actually building the right capability? The leadership mindset that is required to be able to build this. This is everybody from CHROs to line managers, leadership teams within organizations. How do we start to create a conducive environment to allow this new world to play out and to be able to exist? And the point I just made around reinventing or repurposing a skill set, that's quite different to phasing out or saying that jobs are redundant, but actually looking at them in a different way to how we've done before. And also, obviously, the issue of flexible work arrangements. We had a taste of that this year with the climate around the virus, but over and above that, people are talking about hybrid models, what stays, what goes, what did we learn from this period, and how do we want to be able to apply it differently going forward. Now, bringing it all together, it also just requires us looking at it from a multidimensional perspective. Sometimes it's about cross-functional collaborations. Recently, in some industries, they even have cross-organizational collaborations in terms of coming up with solutions and giving talents a different experience. How do you deal with issues of engagement in this new environment? So if we do keep some of those elements around a hybrid organization, virtual organizations, employee engagement is still key, because at the end of the day, we still are social beings and we require that. How do we use experiences and assignments differently as accelerators of growth? In some organizations like ours, we've had expatriation for a long time, which is still there as a tool for development. One of the things we're doing is reviewing that, does it make sense to do it in the way that we've done it before? A lot of organizations are having those conversations. How could we look at that model differently to create different experiences across even different organizations or different industries where there's no maybe obvious threats or competition, but to really broaden our outlook in terms of how we look at career pathing and making sure that we actually create a different outlook in terms of how we do this. And I would say maybe the last one, also just looking at the time, because we'll touch on a lot of these, I think, during the panel, would be to challenge HR as well. So HR as change champions, we're always being challenged to be business partners who have business acumen and understand where the organization would be. So this period, it actually also requires HR to be leaders in terms of actually being more proactive in understanding business change and being able to translate that into the talent agenda.